Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Kaiwen, and this is my project called The Alternative History and Speculative Present of Hogan Sally. Before we go any deeper into my work, I would like to acknowledge and thank the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, on whose unceded traditional territories we live and learn as uninvited guests. And I think it's very important for us to remember and to remind ourselves how fortunate we are to be able to gather on this stolen land. I would like I would also like to express my deepest condolences to what is happening not just in the States, but I believe around the world, in which so many unarmed black people are being murdered because of systemic racism. I believe we have the responsibility to stand against racism and support the Black Lives Matter movement to fight for justice. Standing against racism and discrimination has always been the main motivation for my work, for my project, as I'm applying design methods to speak for people who are lack of voice. So now I will start by stating that the advancement feedback I received from my interim thesis was very useful and important. During my advancement review, my main feedback for improvement was to research more on the theoretical foundations of my work to better understand the design terrain that I'm working within, and also to seek out examples and sources to strengthen my work with theory, and of course to continue my making practice through little experiments and more sketching, and finally reaching out to the relevant communities for more conversation. As a result, my supervisor, Dr. Hertz, suggested I read a few articles, which are very helpful. Here's a summary of the article that I have read. British artist James Auger has proposed that sometimes a design has been compromised due to many factors since the beginning of the last century and beyond. By removing constraints of certain historical events linked to the real-world problems, it can help us to reimagine a scenario or product to hack the system. Auger has brought up the concept of product lineage, which I think is very helpful for speculative design practices. So let's look at this diagram Auger has proposed. We can see the product lineage here. So time goes from the past, which is on the left, all the way to the future, which is on the right. And when we have an emerging technology, it gets domesticated over time and made into a real product. Designers can use this lineage to predict the speculated future. But look, here is the interesting part. What if we have the superpower to rewrite history? It leaves us with space to be innovative about what might possibly happen in the past and how it will affect the world right now. Okay, for example, has anyone watched Black Panther? By the way, RIP to Chadwick Boseman, who just had passed away at the age of 43, which was truly devastating. So do you know, like, the idea of Wakanda is based on which the history of Africa was different. They created a very different present and a very different future for a fictional African country. So with this in mind, designers should always consider that every single object or choice we make now would possibly be a critical indicator of tomorrow. Um, so I work in the interior and architectural design field, and my current practice is focusing on how designers should responsibly enhance the living experiences for groups that lack a voice. I have researched different historical events and tried to change the path of those events and create a scenario based on the alternative history. So one methodology that Auger has proposed to help address these matters is design fiction or alternative present in speculative futures. But I would like to rephrase this a little bit to better fit my project and make it to alternative history and speculative present. And I'm going to use this methodology for my project to see if it really works. So now I'm going to talk about my project from the earlier stage. I did my apprenticeship with Sherry Kajiwara. She's the executive committee of Landscape of Injustice and the director of Nikkei National Museum. From this apprenticeship, I have learned that on December 8th, 1941, The United States declared war on Japan because of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. As a result, the Canadian government took the parallel actions because they were concerned that the Japanese Canadians living in the lower mainland would spy on Canadian military activities. In 1942, more than 20,000 persons of Japanese racial origin were forced to vacate their homes and sent to concentration camps in BC's interior with only 2 days of notice. So, the path of what actually happened in history is shown here by this white dot. Did you see this? But I was hoping to create a speculated community based on the alternative history in which the Japanese Canadians have not been forcibly removed. So here's the fictional timeline that I created, represented in the yellow dot. So for this project, I have made these architectural models from scratch and made them into realistic 3D renderings. What I did was that I actually constructed 3 buildings and designed the floor plans, structures, landscapes, lightings, and everything by using Autodesk softwares. So one is a 3-story pagoda style structure, and here are the renderings. And one is a 2-story modern house, and then here is a glass tea house in between of these buildings, and this is the elevation plan, and here is a view from the tea house. So I was hoping to place my buildings in locations where Japanese Canadians were used to reside, so I selected a part of Vancouver's map in CAD Mapper and developed a 3D model using AutoCAD. So I could put my buildings onto the map in this part of Vancouver, which is also the background of this PowerPoint that you guys have been seeing during the whole presentation. So as you can see, I placed my buildings in between the modern city of Vancouver, and it somehow has changed my project. I realized it was near a historical area named Hogan's Alley. One thing that is unexpected that I learned is that in terms of studio production, it's not just about the end product, but the story behind the things that I make is also very important. So I decided to reach out to the Hogan's Alley Society to learn more about its history. Lama Mogabo, who's the community planner at Hogan's Alley Society, replied quickly back to me, and he explained the history of the neighborhood between the 1850s to 1972. So one part of the history that is worth noting in Vancouver is that the neighborhoods around Hogan's Alley were ethnically diverse during the 20th century. This area was home to many Chinese, Japanese, and African Canadian families and businesses. The people, especially non-white groups, have been calling this place home for centuries because of its strong sense of community. Around 1970s, most black neighborhoods in Vancouver were destroyed because of the construction of Georgia Viaduct, a raised roadway that connects East Vancouver with downtown. Many African Canadians were forced to vacate their community, and Hogan's Alley was mostly demolished. To this day, there's virtually no evidence of Hogan's Alley still exists. As a result, much of the cultural heritage of Vancouver's first and last black neighborhood has been erased. So I have told Lama about my project and how I intended to use this design fiction to create the alternative history and speculative present of Hogan's Alley. And he was very interested in this project and willing to meet with me and talk a bit more. So here you can see this diagram we talked before. On the top corner is the actual timeline of Hogan's Alley's history, represented by the white line. But just because it happened in the past, it doesn't mean it was right. Actually, the construction of Georgia Viaduct was unethical and even racist. So in contrast, here is the alternative timeline that I proposed, focusing on swerving the lineage of different historical events, which is in the yellow line. So the scenario that I'm using for my studio research in this year ahead is based on an alternative past where neighborhoods around Hogan's Alley were not torn down. What would Hogan's Alley look like in 2020 if it was never demolished for building the Georgia Viaduct? And would it be something like Wakanda? As a part of my work, this alternative timeline reimagines that the residents in the community have not been forced to vacate their homes due to the alliances of community activists. Then the unique culture will be presented to the public in today's Vancouver. And coincidentally, Magabo and his team are also working on rebuilding the neighborhood for Vancouver's Black community. So we will continue our conversation and see if there's a potential that our projects might come across each other in the near future. So in the fall, I will continue talking to Lamar Magabo and the Hogan Sally Society, and I'm open to collaborating with them over the next year with my graduate thesis. And I'm planning on reading the books he suggested me, The Blue Road, A Fable of Migration, and The Outer Harbor. The author of these books, Wade Compton, is the teaching faculty of creative writing at Douglas College. So I'm planning on meeting him as well to talk a bit more. I will also keep making architectural models and renderings for the speculative Hokinsali Cultural Center, which I'm designing, and introduce my design proposal to the city of Vancouver to see if they might be interested. So it's worth mentioning that the methodology of alternative history and speculative present and design fiction is very helpful. I have tried this methodology for my project and it worked well. And I like to encourage all designers to have disciplined empathy for historically underrepresented groups. And I think it's very important. And this methodology can really help. It productively presents a different scenario and inspires people to pay more attention to the past. This helps people to challenge and rethink assumptions about the present. So thanks everybody, and especially thanks to my supervisor, Dr. Hertz, for his help and advice. And I look forward to continuing my work on this project, and I'm excited to see how Hogan's Alley evolves as if it still exists. Okay, so thank you, and I'm open to take any questions.